The town called her prey. She was the most dangerous person on that street. They knew her only as the Mochi woman, a Japanese widow who sold pale rice cakes from a wooden board to keep from starving in a Wyoming trading post. Then a solitary rancher bought every cake she had and asked her to marry him before sundown, never knowing the woman he'd claimed had been raised in a samurai house and trained to kill before she could cook. Stay until the end to see how the food that kept her alive became the trail that led her hunters to her door. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Cedar Wells sat in the kind of country that makes a person tired just looking at it. A flat stretch of alkali and scrub where the wind never stopped pushing dust into the cracks of every building on the single street. The trading post had been built by a man too stubborn to ride another mile west, and the whole town had grown up around his bad decision. Nobody stayed here on purpose. The street held 3 saloons, a livery, a marshal's office that was mostly a chair, and Poole's general store, which was the only reason anyone came to town at all. She was there every supply day before the heat woke up, standing behind a board of pale round cakes she had made before dawn in the dirt yard behind the stable. The cakes were mochi, pounded from a short-grained sticky rice she had carried from a coastal town 2 territories back, and no one in Cedar Wells had a name for them or a reason to want one. She had adapted the old craft to a single pair of hands, because there was no second pair of hands to turn the dough. While she swung the mallet, that was the dangerous part. The rice had to be steamed soft and then beaten in a stone mortar with a heavy wooden mallet until the grains disappeared into one smooth white mass. The mass hardened the moment it cooled, so the work had to be fast. Alone, she worked slower than the old rhythm required, pounding and turning and wetting her hand in the same motion, the dough hot enough to blister if she hesitated. The old way was a 2-person dance, one swinging the mallet, and one turning the dough and splashing hot water so the rice didn't seize, and the 2 of them shouted to keep the rhythm, because a missed beat meant a broken hand. Alone, the rhythm was slower. She trusted her own timing, and the cakes came out a little denser than the ones her grandmother had made in Kyoto, but whole and sellable and recognizably themselves. The first week, the men on the boardwalk had treated her board like a joke. One of them picked up a cake, squeezed it, and dropped it back with a laugh that carried the length of the street. Then a teamster bought one on a dare and chewed it standing up. And his face changed in a way he couldn't hide, and he bought 3 more before he left. Word moves fast in a town with nothing else to do. By the 2nd month, she was trading cakes for flour and salt and coffee on credit in Poole's store. And Poole, who had never given credit to a woman alone, was writing her name in his ledger without being asked twice. He wrote her down as Mochi, because she had never given him another name, and she didn't correct him. The store was the heart of the place, the spot where every rider off the trail came to settle up and hear the news, which meant the board outside Poole's door put her in front of every pair of eyes that passed through the territory. And that was both the reason she ate, the reason she couldn't disappear. She was, as far as anyone in Cedar Wells knew, the only Japanese woman any of them had ever seen, and that made her as conspicuous as a candle in a dark room. The conspicuousness was the price of the trade, and the trade was the only thing keeping her alive. So she paid the price and stood where they could see her, and never once asked any of them for help. Her rice was running low. One bad week, one stretch of days when the teamsters took a different road, and the board would be empty, and the credit would dry up, and the town would remember that a small foreign woman alone wasn't, in their math, a person they needed to keep. She had learned, long ago, that the only real safety on a frontier street was being too useful to destroy. The rice cakes were the one thing she could carry from a home that no longer existed, the one skill no amount of dust and hunger could take out of her hands. That was the whole strategy. Though she stood behind her board, in the heat and the dust and the stares, and she didn't flinch, and she waited for the next customer the way her father had taught her to wait, with her weight settled and her hands still and her eyes on the whole street at once. Wes Tucker rode into Cedar Wells on a Thursday with a list in his head and a worn saddlebag over his shoulder, looking for tack and grain and a length of rope that wouldn't snap the first time a horse pulled against it. He ran the Broken Arrow 15 miles north of town by himself, which was a slow way to run a ranch and a fast way to go quiet in the head, and he came in twice a month and spoke to as few people as he could manage. He was the kind of man the town had stopped trying to talk to. Broad across the shoulders and careful with his hands, with a calm that wasn't performed so much as built into him the way a wall is built into a house. Wes kept to himself. He saw her before he reached Pools. The boardwalk had cleared a little around her, the way water clears around a stone, and 3 men had settled onto the rail nearby, with the loose, patient posture of men waiting for something to go wrong so they could enjoy it. One of them called a price at her that wasn't a price for cakes, and the other 2 laughed, and she didn't look up. Wes stopped his horse and watched her not look up, and something in the quality of her stillness made him watch longer than he meant to. The 3 on the rail were waiting for flinch, and they weren't getting it, and a woman who doesn't flinch when she's supposed to is either a fool or something the 3 of them have not correctly identified. He had seen fear dressed up as calm before. This wasn't that. The woman at the board wasn't pretending to be unafraid. She was simply not afraid. And the difference was visible the way the difference between a sleeping dog and a dead dog is visible if you know how to look. Her weight was settled low, one hand resting on the board and the other hidden in the fold of her coat, and she was watching the whole street without moving her head. He hadn't expected that. Wes walked his horse to the rail and tied it and stepped onto the boardwalk, and the 3 men on the rail straightened a little because Wes Tucker wasn't a man they wanted to explain themselves to. He looked at the board of pale round cakes and asked the price, and she told him, and he counted out coin for every cake on the board. The 3 men went quiet. She didn't blink. He counted out a little more and asked if she had more at home, and she said no, and he put the cakes into his saddlebag one at a time, while the town watched a solitary rancher buy a stranger's entire living in one transaction. Then he did the thing that made the 3 men on the rail stop laughing entirely. He set his hat back on his head and asked her to marry him, plainly the way a man asks for a refill of coffee, and he said it before the sun went down, because he didn't intend to leave her standing on that boardwalk after dark. It wasn't romance. He had seen the math the town was doing on her, the slow math of men who decide a woman alone is eventually going to need someone, whether she wants to or not, and he had decided to change the math before the answer came in. A lonely rancher buying a stranger's whole board was a strange enough sight that the story would be all over Cedar Wells by supper time, and a story that big was the cheapest fence a man could build around a woman in a place like this. She studied him the way her father had taught her to read a man who was offering something, his hands first, then his posture, then whether the calm in him was real or something he was holding together with effort. His hands were steady, and his shoulders were loose, and the calm went all the way down. She asked him one question, which was whether he would take a wife who wouldn't give him her real name and who wouldn't answer questions about where she had learned to stand the way she stood. He said yes. Then she said she would marry him, and she began to pack the board, and the 3 men on the rail didn't say a word because there was nothing left to say. The ride north took most of the afternoon, and none of the ease that an afternoon ride is supposed to hold, because 2 people who have agreed to a life together without knowing each other have very little to say out loud. They rode in silence. Wes rode ahead, and she rode behind on the mare he had bought from the livery for her, and the country opened up into long brown rolls of grass that turned gold where the sun hit them and shadow where it didn't. She watched the way he handled his horse and his tack, the small automatic corrections of a man who had done this work alone for enough years that the horse was almost a part of his thinking, and she decided that the calm she had read on the boardwalk wasn't a thing he performed, but a thing he lived in. He watched her ride, and what he saw was a woman who hadn't been raised to a saddle. She sat correct and balanced, which told him she had been taught to carry herself, but her hands on the reins were careful in the way of a person who had learned the skill late and didn't yet trust it. A woman who holds her spine like a soldier and her reins like a stranger has a story in the gap between those two things, and Wes wasn't the kind of man to ask a stranger for her story on the first ride. Midway to the ranch he offered her his canteen, and she took it and rinsed her hands before she drank. A slow, deliberate rinsing that had nothing to do with the trail dust and everything to do with the discipline she carried the way other people carry habits. Wes noticed, and he said nothing about it. The Broken Arrows sat in a shallow valley with water in it, and a low house built of timber and a barn that was in better repair than the house, which told her what she needed to know about where he put his care. He showed her the house and the stove and the room she would have, and he said he would sleep in the barn until she decided otherwise, and he said it without embarrassment, because embarrassment would have implied he expected something. The room was hers. She set her 2 bags inside the door, the medicine box and the longer wrap box, and she didn't let either of them out of her sight. That night she cooked the last of the mochi she had carried in her saddlebag, grilling the rounds on the stove's iron top and wrapping them in the dried seaweed she had kept folded in paper since the coast, a way of preparing them that turned the chewy cakes crisp on the outside and soft inside and salted with the sea. She set the plate between them, and he ate one, and then he ate another, and then he sat for a long time without speaking. Something passed between them, in that silence, that wasn't love and not trust. It was a recognition, 2 people who had both learned what it cost to stand alone against a thing bigger than themselves, and neither of them had a word for it yet. So they let the food do the talking and the night close around them without a promise beyond the one they had already made. Within 2 weeks she had rebuilt the trade from his courtyard, pounding the rice in a stone mortar he found for her in the back of the barn and steaming it in a wooden basket over an iron pot. And on supply days she rode in with Wes and set up her board at Pools while he bought his grain and his tack. The town watched her work the way it watched everything, and the watching changed. The pound and turn rhythm was the part that held them. Danger of it, the heavy mallet coming down where her hand had been a half-second before, the dough hot and sticky and hardening as it cooled, so that a hesitation meant a ruined batch and a miss meant a broken finger. She worked the mallet alone, turning and wetting and pounding in one continuous motion, and the men on the boardwalk stopped laughing at the foreign woman and started counting the days until she came back. The thing that turned the town from tolerance into respect happened at the ranch, a morning when one of Wes's seasonal hands came up from the lower pasture with an arm that had gone wrong. A cut from a fence wire had swollen and turned the color of bad meat, and the hand was pale and sweating and holding the arm away from his body the way a man holds something that has started to belong to the infection instead of to him. The nearest doctor was 2 days' ride, and the hand didn't have 2 days in him by the look of his face. He was running out of time. Hanako went to the smaller of her 2 bags and opened the lacquered box she had carried across the ocean, a box the color of dark wine with brass corners, and inside it lay a row of needles, so fine they caught no light at all, tools her grandmother had used in Kyoto before Hanako was born. She didn't explain them. She cleaned the arm and worked the needles into the skin around the swelling, in a pattern the hand couldn't follow and Wes couldn't read, and her face, while she worked was a face he had seen once before on the boardwalk. The face of a person doing something precise and difficult as though it were ordinary. The swelling drained that night and the fever broke before dawn, and the hand kept his arm. Wes watched her close the lacquered box and set it back by the door, and what he understood wasn't what the needles were, but what the woman who owned them was, which was more than a cook and more than a stranger and more than the name Poole had written in his ledger. She was all of those things at once. The town heard about the hand within the week, because a man whose arm you've saved will tell the story whether you ask him to or not. And after that, the coins at her board were real coins, and the offers that weren't about cakes stopped entirely. She had done the thing she had always done, which was make herself too useful to destroy, and the usefulness had spread from the cakes to the needles to the quiet fact that a rancher with a reputation for not caring about anyone had ridden out in front of the whole town and claimed her. He didn't know yet what he had claimed. He found the second bag on a rainy afternoon when he had come into the house for a length of twine, and she was in the courtyard under the awning, pounding rice, and the longer wrapped box sat at the foot of her bed where she kept it pushed against the wall. It was longer than the medicine box, and wrapped in cloth that had been washed so many times it had gone soft and the color of nothing, and it had a small brass lock on it that she kept on her person rather than with the box. He stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long moment, and then he took his twine from the shelf and went back out to the yard and didn't open it, and didn't ask. The box stayed closed. That night she sat awake with the box across her knees, and for the first time since she had come to the Broken Arrow, the past came up out of the place she had put it and sat in the room with her. The past wouldn't stay buried. She had been born in Izu, in a house where the women were taught the blade the same as the men because the men were dying and the household had to be defended by whoever was left standing. Her father had been samurai to a clan that lost a war in the year the old world ended, and he had taught her the long polearm with the curved blade because he had no sons left to teach, and he had taught her that the only dishonor was the one you earned, never the one done to you. She had left Japan with a husband who died between San Francisco and Wyoming, and she had buried him in a dry county and kept walking east until the rice ran low and the trade began. The box held the blade, broken down and wrapped in oiled cloth, and the family register from Izu, with her father's name and her name written in it, and it was the only proof in this country that she had ever been anyone other than the Mochi woman. She kept it locked because the blade and the name were the same thing, and the name was the thing the men were looking for, and she hadn't survived this long by leaving the thing they wanted where they could find it. A hidden blade stays whole. Her father had told her that once, and she had carried the saying across an ocean and 2 territories and a husband's grave without ever having to test it, and she could feel the test coming now the way you can feel weather change before the clouds show. She didn't know yet that the looking had already reached Cedar Wells. A stranger had passed through town that same week and asked Poole, casual as a man asking the weather, about the Japanese woman, and a clan name Poole had never heard and couldn't have pronounced. Hanako hadn't been in town that day, and Poole had shrugged and said he only knew her as Mochi, and the stranger had ridden on toward the next settlement with the unhurried ease of a man checking a list. The wind had shifted, and she couldn't feel it yet, but the dust it was carrying was already on the road, and a woman who sells food at every crossroads she stops at leaves a trail as plain as a wagon track, and the trail ran straight back to her. 3 men rode into Cedar Wells on a Monday, and they weren't lawmen, and they weren't teamsters, and they weren't anything the town wanted to keep. They asked at the saloon for a Japanese woman, and then they asked for her by her father's clan name that meant nothing to anyone in the room, but that meant a great deal to the woman they were looking for. The three were the brothers of a man she had killed in another territory town months before Cedar Wells, in a yard behind a stable where three men had come for a lone, foreign woman in the dark, and one of them hadn't walked back out of the dark. One brother stayed in that yard. They had followed her the only way she could be followed, which was the mochi, the pale cakes that turned up at every trading post she stopped at, because the trade was who she was and she couldn't stop being it without starving. The town that had tolerated her for the sake of the cakes and the needles turned in the space of an afternoon. Poole, who had written her name in his ledger and called her a good customer, told the three men exactly where the broken arrow sat in the valley, because Poole was a storekeeper and not a friend, and the three men were paying customers too. The marshal, who had never once cared what happened to a Japanese woman on his street, suddenly cared a great deal about a warrant from the county where the brother had died. It was a killing she had never reported, because no marshal in that county would have taken the word of a widow from Japan over the word of two white men with a dead sibling. He pinned the warrant to his vest the way a man pins on a badge he has been waiting for an excuse to wear, and he started asking around for someone to ride north with him, because a marshal with a witness and a warrant is a marshal who gets paid. Now the law cared. The three brothers were in no hurry. They had ridden a long way on a slow trail of rice cakes, and they had years of grief to spend, and they drank at the saloon, and they let the town see their guns. They made sure everyone understood that the woman they were looking for had killed their brother, and that the killing was a debt that only one thing could settle. Cedar Wells listened the way small towns listen, with the whole weight of the street leaning toward the interesting part, and not one person in it rode north to warn the rancher's wife. The same boardwalk that had watched her pound rice and counted the days until her cakes came back now watched three armed men drink and plan, and said nothing, because the town had liked her usefulness, but it had never owed her anything, and a town that hasn't owed you anything won't risk itself to keep you. Wes heard it in town from a boy who ran errands for the saloon, a boy who told him the way boys tell things, half proud and half scared, that three riders had asked for his wife's real name and ridden north. He didn't finish his business at Poole's. He left the grain on the counter and the tack on the rail, and he rode hard for home with the mare stretching out under him and the dust coming up behind him in a long straight line. The trade she had built to keep herself alive had done the one thing she couldn't forgive it for. It had made her visible, and the visibility that had protected her in Cedar Wells was the same visibility that had led the brothers straight to the valley where she slept, and everything she had earned in this country was balanced now on the 15 miles between the town and the ranch, and how fast one man could ride them. He reached the ranch before the riders, and he didn't leave. Wheeze dismounted in the yard, and she was already standing in the door of the house, and the look on her face said she had heard it in the sound of his horse coming too fast. The way a person who has lived through trouble hears trouble in the rhythm of hoofbeats before they hear anything else. He asked her the one question she had told him never to ask, which was whether she had killed a man, and he asked it plain, because there was no time for anything but plain. She answered him the way her father's house required a question to be answered, which was straight and without apology. 3 men had come for her in a yard behind a stable in the last county. In the dark, the way men come for a woman they believe has no one to answer for her. One of them had died. The other 2 had run. She hadn't reported it because the marshal in that county would have looked at her and looked at the 2 survivors and done the math the way Poole did math, and the math wouldn't have come out in her favor, and so she had walked east and kept walking until the rice ran low and the board went up again in Cedar Wells. The telling was without softening and without pride, the way a person reports a fact that has already been weighed and settled, and the settling had happened a long time ago in a dark yard that smelled like hay and iron. The marriage they had built on not asking collapsed in that doorway into something harder and quieter, which was a marriage built on knowing and staying anyway. He didn't leave. Wes stood in the yard, and she understood then that the calm she had read in him on the boardwalk had been the real thing and not a performance, because a man whose calm was a performance would have ridden out the moment he heard the word killed. Then he asked her one more thing, which was whether she would have told him if the brothers hadn't come, and she said no, because the name she had refused to give him was the same name the brothers carried, and a name that draws armed men isn't a gift you hand to a man who has done you no harm. Hanako went into the house and came back with the longer wrapped box, and she set it on the table between them, and she unlocked the brass lock with the key she wore on a cord inside her collar. Inside the cloth was the blade, the long polearm with the curved steel at the end, broken down into 2 wrapped pieces and oiled against the damp, and beside it the family register from Aizu, with her father's name and hers written in the brush hand of a man who had been dead for years. She showed him what she was. She didn't apologize for it, because the code she had been raised in didn't permit apology for a clean killing done in self-defense. And she didn't explain the code, because the code wasn't a thing you explained, it was a thing you carried. He didn't understand the code. What he understood was the woman inside it, which was the only part that mattered. He set the box back on the table and he began to plan how to keep her not from the law, because the law was a paper thing that would come later, but from 3 men who wanted her dead and who were even now riding the last miles of the road into the valley. The riders came at dusk, when the light had gone the color of old brass and the valley had started to cool, and they came the way men come who expect to find a foreign woman cowering behind a rancher and a closed door. What they found instead was the detail that shouldn't have been there. Anako stood in the yard in front of the house, and in her hands she held a weapon none of them had ever seen, a long pole with a curved blade at the end of it. She held it the way only a person who had been trained to it from childhood holds a weapon, which is to say, she held it the way another person holds their own arm. Wes stepped out of the house and set himself between her and the 3 men, and he said the line the whole story had been building toward, the 3 words that changed the math of the yard the way they had changed the math of the boardwalk. "That's my wife." The lead rider looked at Wes, and then at her, and then at the blade, and he laughed, the way men laugh when they have decided a woman is still prey, regardless of what she's holding. And he said that a wife who had killed his brother was a wife he intended to put in the ground beside him. Wes didn't move. He hadn't expected to spend his evening this way, but he hadn't moved from the boardwalk either, and not moving was the thing he knew how to do best. What came next wasn't a battle, and it wasn't a spectacle, because she didn't fight the way men out here fought, loud and forward, and hoping to scare. She fought as her father had trained her to defend a household, which was with the length of the blade, doing the work her body couldn't do, the long pole keeping the men at the distance where their knives and their reach stopped being useful. The blade did the work. The naginata is built for exactly this, to hold a larger opponent at bay, and she held them at bay the way a wall holds water, calm and complete and without rage. She was the kind of calm that only comes from having already accepted the worst possible outcome, and a person who has accepted the worst possible outcome is the most dangerous person in any yard, because there's nothing left you can threaten to take from her. One of the brothers came in, low and fast, believing the length would fail him at close quarters, and the blade did the thing it was made to do, and he went down in the dirt and didn't get up. The other 2 broke. They had ridden north expecting prey, and they had found something older and colder than anything the frontier had taught them to expect. And they ran for their horses and they rode out of the valley the way men ride who have decided that a brother isn't worth the price of the woman who killed him. The whole thing took less time than it takes to tell, which is how a trained blade settles a yard, fast and final, and without the long noise that a fight makes when both sides are guessing. The marshal came after with the warrant in his saddlebag and the careful face of a man who would rather the problem solve itself. West stood in the yard and offered him the thing the frontier respected more than paper, which was witnesses. The hand whose arm she had saved, and the storekeeper who had sold her flour, and the whole town that had watched her work for coin and never once seen her ask anyone for help. Witnesses beat paper. The marshal looked at the dead man's record, and he looked at her standing in the door with the blade still in her hands, and he looked at the quiet rancher who had claimed her in front of the whole street, and he left the warrant in his saddlebag, and he rode back towards Cedar Wells, and he didn't come back. A warrant that no one in the county wants to serve is just paper in a pocket, and the marshal had decided early in the evening that this particular paper was going to stay in his pocket. The yard was clean by morning. Wes had seen to that before the light came up, because a clean yard is the first thing a household puts back in order when the trouble is done, and he understood households now in a way he hadn't understood them a month ago. She was already at the courtyard mortar when he came out, the rice steaming in the basket and the stone mortar set on its stand, and the heavy mallet in her hands, and the board was going up again because she was who she was. The craft didn't stop because the world had tried to end the night before. He stood in the door and watched her work the pound and turn rhythm in the early cold, the mallet rising and falling where her hand had been, and for the first time he saw the whole woman standing in one place, the survivor and the cook and the healer and the blade, and he didn't look away. She stopped the work, and she did a thing she hadn't done since the boardwalk, which was give something freely instead of bargaining it away. She told him her real name, one written in the register from Aizu, the one the brothers had been riding to find, and she gave it to him because the bargain that had kept it hidden was finished, and there was no longer a reason to hold it back from the man who had stood between her and 3 killers and not moved. He said it once, badly, the syllables coming out in the wrong order, the way they always came out wrong in an English mouth, and she corrected his vowels with the patience of a woman who had heard her name broken before, and they both almost smiled. It was the first time either of them had almost smiled at the other in the same moment. It was a small thing. That was also the first true thing either of them had offered the other. The marriage that had begun as a contract of ignorance was now a marriage built on the full truth of who she was, and the truth was heavier than the contract and steadier than the contract, and the only one of the two that could have survived a yard full of armed men. She had spent her whole time here, holding the two halves of herself apart. The Mochi woman the town could see, and the daughter of Aizu the town couldn't, and the yard had pressed the two halves together until they fit. The woman who walked back to the mortar this morning was both at once, and wasn't going to split herself in half again for anyone's comfort. She was whole now. The town would hear about the riders within the day, because a town hears everything eventually, and the town that had watched her bleed for coin would now trade with her more respectfully than it had ever traded. Not because she was innocent, because she wasn't, and not because she was harmless, because she was the opposite of harmless. She was neither of those things. It would trade with her respectfully because she was useful and dangerous, and the frontier doesn't reward purity. It rewards the kind of calm that has already accepted the worst. And the cost of that calm is that she would never again be only the Mochi woman, and she had known that cost on the boardwalk, and she had paid it then, and she was paying it still. The Mochi sold out by noon. Inside the ranch door, the naginata hung on the wall in 2 clean pieces, oiled and open again for the first time since she left Aizu. She survived by being too useful to destroy, and now she was known and never quite safe, the only safety a frontier offers. If this story held you, hit like and comment your city so I can see how far it travels.